If you think your local HOA holds too much power, you haven't heard half the story. Stick around. What happens when they step on the wrong toes might just change how you view small-town politics forever. Ready to find out? Let's dive in. Margaret Taylor was an 82-year-old widow, the type of gentle soul who greeted neighbors with homemade cookies and never missed a Sunday potluck at First Baptist. She lived in the same modest ranch-style house in Lakeview Pines for over 50 years. Nestled between ancient oaks, the house was her sanctuary. She'd raised a family there, watched her grandchildren hunt for Easter eggs in the backyard, and even refused to evacuate during a threatening hurricane decades ago, all because this was her home. So imagine her confusion when a notice arrived from the Lakeview Pines Homeowners Association. The letterhead looked official, with a gold embossed crest and bold block letters. It read, "Dear Mrs. Taylor, we regret to inform you that, effective immediately, your property is under consideration for eminent domain on behalf of the Lakeview Pines HOA Development Committee. The plan includes a proposed parking lot that will benefit the greater community. Please call our offices within 72 hours to discuss your options." For a moment, Margaret thought she was reading a piece of junk mail. She double-checked the address. Indeed, it was hers. But that line, "proposed parking lot," made no sense. The HOA had always been more about who could or couldn't hang decorative flags than seizing people's property. And anyway, Margaret was certain the local government, not an HOA, had eminent domain authority, if such a measure was even possible. She called the HOA office, only to get stonewalled by a perfunctory response. "Thank you for your call. Our next open appointment is in 3 weeks." Margaret felt a chill gnaw at her spine. She tried to remain calm. Then she called her son, Michael Taylor, mayor of Lakeview Pines. Michael was younger than most people expected for a mayor, 46, with the peppered hair of a man who'd seen enough local scandals to age him beyond his years. He had won the election on a platform of transparency and community, vowing to break the mold of the same old city politics. The timing had seemed right. The town was on the cusp of transformation as new businesses migrated to the region. When Margaret's name popped up on Michael's phone that afternoon, he was in a meeting discussing local beautification projects. He whispered a quick apology to the city planner and stepped out into the hallway, a Spartan high-ceilinged corridor that smelled faintly of disinfectant. "Hi, Mom," Michael said, adjusting the phone. "Everything okay?" Margaret's voice trembled. "No, son, it's not. I got this notice from the HI. They say they want my house for a parking lot. Something about eminent domain. But can they even do that?" Michael felt his heart rate spike. "What? No, that's ridiculous. Eminent domain is a municipal or state matter. HOAs don't have that power." "Are you sure that's what they said?" "Yes, I'm certain. I've lived here 50 years. Why now?" Michael quickly reassured her. "Don't worry, Ma. I'll look into it. Probably some big misunderstanding." However, Michael knew better than to dismiss an HOA matter as a mere misunderstanding. He'd tangled with the Lakeview Pines HOA once before, when they tried to impose a new monthly fee for landscape improvements. That fiasco had cost local homeowners hundreds of dollars, only for the plan to be quietly retracted. The rumor was that the HOA's board had a few self-appointed visionaries who liked to push boundaries. But to tear down someone's home for a parking lot, that smelled rotten. As soon as he hung up, Michael dialed his friend Sylvia, who served as the city council's liaison to all local HOAs. Sylvia was known for her meticulous record-keeping and no-nonsense approach. As soon as Michael explained the situation, she promised to dig into the files. After half an hour, she called back sounding flabbergasted. "Michael, I don't know how they're justifying it, but there's a document on file. It's not officially recognized by the city, though. Looks like they're citing some archaic provision about expansion for community assets. This is shady. Someone's pulling strings." "We'll see about that," Michael responded, thinking about all the times his mother had hosted half the neighborhood in her living room or baked bread for new arrivals on the block. Her home was more than a structure. It was part of the town's living memory. The next day, Michael took a personal day off from mayoral duties and went to see his mother. Stubborn as a bull, Margaret refused to let worry overshadow her hospitality. She was waiting on the porch with fresh lemonade in hand. "Sweetheart, the best I can do is keep calm, right? she said, offering a half-smile. But her eyes betrayed her nervousness. Michael stepped inside and found a stack of letters from the HOA, each more urgent than the last. He flipped through them, his anger rising with every official-sounding threat. The nerve of these people. He decided to drive straight to the HOA offices. Margaret insisted on coming along. "I might be old, but I'm not invisible," she said firmly. When they arrived at the HOA headquarters, a neatly manicured building ironically surrounded by free parking spaces, Michael was met by a receptionist who barely glanced up from her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Michael straightened his tie. "I'm Michael Taylor, mayor of Lakeview Pines. This is my mother, Margaret Taylor. We need to speak to whoever is in charge of these notices." The receptionist looked up, lips parted in mild surprise. But her voice was robotic. "Our board members are in a closed session. You can leave a message." It took every ounce of Michael's discipline not to raise his voice. "We're not leaving until we speak to someone." Just then, a tall figure in a sharply pressed suit appeared in the hallway. He wore a name badge, Cody Barnes, HOA president. Barnes ambled over, a rehearsed grin plastered on his face. "Mayor Taylor, I'm sorry, we're quite busy at the moment. Perhaps we can schedule. We're here about the condemnation notice you sent to my mother," Michael cut in. Cody's smile faltered slightly. "We're simply following established procedures, nothing personal. If you like, we can set up a formal hearing next month." Margaret's hands trembled, but she mustered her courage. "My home is not a piece of land you can just seize." "I don't understand." Cody raised an eyebrow. "It's about the collective good. We have big plans to turn this area into a community hotspot. It'll increase property values across the board." Michael's frustration boiled. "You can't play fast and loose with eminent domain. That's not how it works. And you certainly can't do it without going through the city." Barnes offered a paper-thin smile. "We'll let a judge decide." Then he pivoted on his polished shoe and returned to his meeting, leaving mother and son standing in the lobby, blindsided. Michael clenched his fist but took a deep breath. "Okay, Ma, we'll fight this. They have no legal ground. I'll make sure of it." Still, the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach warned him. This was just the beginning of a battle he never expected to wage, much less against a homeowners association. That same afternoon, Michael found himself in his city office, scanning every relevant ordinance, property code, and local law. Sylvia was on speakerphone, rifling through her own trove of records. The city council never approved any land transfer or eminent domain usage for a parking lot, she said, voice echoing slightly. "This is definitely not city-sanctioned." Michael rubbed his temples. "So how are they even getting away with sending out official notices?" "That's just it. We don't know," Sylvia admitted. "They might be forging some sort of partial agreement or exploiting a loophole from old charter documents. HOAs can have bizarre bylaws that linger for decades. Usually they revolve around petty stuff like fence heights, not demolishing entire homes." Michael exhaled, tapping his pen. "You think I should address this publicly at the next council meeting?" Sylvia paused. "You're up for re-election soon. Taking on the HOA, especially one as large and influential as Lakeview Pines, could rattle donors and public sentiment. But then again, if they're victimizing your own mother, that might rally support. You'll need to tread carefully." He hated the political dance. He'd run for mayor to help people, not to calculate every move like a chess match. But he also knew how Lakeview Pines ticked. The HOA had allies in high places, real estate developers, local business owners who saw expansion as profit. If they wanted Margaret's home badly enough to try shady tactics, they might have deep pockets backing them. That night, Michael called his mother. She sounded weary, but unwavering. "I had a visitor today," Margaret said. "Some gentleman claiming to be with the HOA's legal counsel. He said I'd be better off accepting a buyout. They even offered to help me relocate to a senior living community." Michael felt a flash of anger. "They're already harassing you at home? What a nerve. Did you tell them to get lost?" Margaret chuckled softly. "I told him I'm not going anywhere until the good Lord calls me home, and that he could relay that message directly to Mr. Barnes." Though it was a brave quip, Michael knew his mother was shaken. He promised they'd get a lawyer. In the meantime, Margaret's neighbor had volunteered to keep watch for any suspicious activity. The neighbors, outraged on her behalf, had begun to form an impromptu support network, baking casseroles, checking in frequently, even planning to attend the next HOA meeting en masse. One thing was clear. Nobody liked the idea of an 82-year-old woman being forced out for a parking lot. As days passed, the tension rose. Michael prepared a press statement, careful to keep emotion in check. But the local news got wind of the story before he could go public. A young reporter named Danielle from Channel 6 cornered him in front of City Hall. Microphone in hand, cameraman rolling, she asked, "Mayor Taylor, is it true your mother's home is being seized by the HOA for a parking lot? Do you plan to take legal action?" Michael hesitated for half a second, scanning the curious onlookers. Then he replied, "My mother's property is not for sale, and the HOA has no right to forcibly take it. We are reviewing all legal options." The story aired that evening, generating a swirl of online chatter. Comments flooded social media platforms, with people decrying the HOA's overreach. Yet some voices emerged praising the idea of a communal expansion, claiming it would modernize the area. Michael bristled at how easily people could reduce Margaret's lifetime of memories to mere real estate. The next day, matters escalated. While Margaret was out grocery shopping, a demolition crew arrived at her driveway. They claimed they were there on official orders to survey and prepare the site. Margaret's neighbor, a retired firefighter named Bill, rushed to intervene. He demanded to see the permit. The crew lead fumbled with his paperwork, which turned out to be an illegible copy that referenced some non-existent city code. Bill called the police, who forced the crew to leave. But the message was clear. The HOA intended to move forward, legally or not. When Michael heard the news, he confronted Cody Barnes in the HOA's echoing lobby. This time, Barnes didn't offer a polite smile. "I suggest you cease interfering, Mayor, before we file an injunction. The improvements we're making are for the good of Lakeview Pines." Michael clenched his jaw. Threatening an elderly woman with demolition crews is not for the good of anyone. "This ends now." Barnes gave a smug shrug. "You're overstepping, Mr. Mayor. We have every right to enforce our covenants. Perhaps you should focus on running the city, not meddling in private affairs." Michael's voice rose, echoing off the immaculate marble floor. "My mother's home is not your private affair. And if you touch one brick, I'll have you charged with trespassing and malicious property damage." Barnes' retort was a quiet, menacing laugh. "Go ahead, try me." Later that night, Michael and Margaret sat in her living room, going through old photo albums as if to anchor themselves in better times. The family pictures, holiday gatherings, everything reminded Michael of why he had to stand firm. That's when the phone rang. Margaret answered, her hand visibly shaking. After a tense moment, she handed the receiver to Michael. A rough voice spoke on the other end. "You think you're special because you're mayor? Stay out of this, or we'll make sure you regret it. We know how to get things done." The line went dead. Michael stared at the phone in disbelief. Whoever it was had threatened him personally. Now it was more than a property dispute. It was intimidation, borderline criminal. He dialed the local police chief, Bob Lansing, an old friend of the family. "Bob, I need help. This is going too far. My mother's safety is on the line." Bob agreed to step up patrols around Margaret's house and investigate the threatening call. But as he hung up, Michael wondered if the police alone could contain the situation. The HOA had shown it was willing to twist any rule, call any bluff. And apparently, they had no qualms about personal threats. At that point, Michael realized they weren't just dealing with a few misguided board members. This was organized and well-funded. Possibly, developers had cut backroom deals with the HOA for a lucrative project. Someone stood to profit significantly from a new commercial zone. And if they demolished Margaret's home, who might be next? Still, Michael had resources too. He had the law on his side, the city council's ear, and a community that deeply respected his mother. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the final straw would come sooner than he expected. Late one evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, Michael was jolted awake by his cell phone. the screen flashing an unknown number. His heart pounded as he picked up. A frantic neighbor shouted over the hum of machinery in the background. "Michael, they're tearing it down. They're tearing your mother's house down right now." Michael drove faster than he ever had in his life, ignoring speed limits as he careened through Lakeview Pines. The city streets were mostly empty at 2 a.m., but his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. "Please let this be a mistake," he begged silently. "Let them have the wrong address." But the instant he turned onto his mother's street, the glaring floodlights confirmed his worst fears. A demolition team, wearing hard hats and neon vests, had already broken through the front windows and were working their way in with sledgehammers and hydraulic equipment. Margaret stood on the sidewalk in her robe, flanked by Bill and a couple of other worried neighbors. The elderly woman's eyes were filled with tears and disbelief. Shards of glass glinted on the front lawn under the lights. Michael screeched to a halt and vaulted out of his car. "Stop! Stop!" he roared, waving his arms. But the machines kept pounding. He lunged for the foreman, a big-bellied man wearing a hoodie under his vest. "Who authorized this? You're trespassing on private property." The foreman shoved a stack of papers at Michael. "HOA board. We got a signed order." Michael snatched the document, scanning it. It looked official, stamped and notarized, but nowhere did it mention city approval. In fact, the text seemed riddled with references to outdated codes and ambiguous community enhancement language. "This is bogus," Michael yelled, tossing the papers aside. "And you all are committing a crime." By then, Police Chief Bob Lansing had arrived, lights flashing. He barked orders at the demolition crew, brandishing his badge. Slowly, grudgingly, they powered down the equipment. But the damage was done. Half the living room wall had collapsed, and the roof sagged dangerously. Margaret's cherished home was partially demolished, debris strewn everywhere. Michael guided his trembling mother across the street. She clutched a small photo frame, an old wedding picture of her and her late husband, having managed to grab it just before the walls came crashing down. "They can't do this," she whispered, stunned. "They just can't." Police officers started taking statements, roping off the property with caution tape. As dawn broke, the story spread like wildfire across social media. Local news vans parked along the curb. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a potential scandal involving illegal demolition, property rights violations, and the humiliating realization that the city's own mayor's mother had been targeted. Michael was livid. He confronted Bob Lansing, voice tight with anger. "Arrest them, Bob. They just demolished my mother's house." "We're gathering evidence," Bob replied, glancing at the battered structure. "We'll need to verify the legal documents. If they acted on a fraudulent order, it's criminal." Fraud or not, Margaret's home was in ruins. And as the adrenaline subsided, she let out a heart-wrenching sob. Michael pulled her into a hug, tears stinging his own eyes. This was more than a legal matter. It was the destruction of a lifetime of memories. That morning, Michael made a public statement at City Hall, flanked by city council members and a swarm of reporters. With a calm fury in his voice, he recounted the unlawful demolition. No organization, be it an HOA or otherwise, has the authority to bulldoze a home without legitimate legal process. Those responsible will be held accountable. Meanwhile, Sylvia worked behind the scenes, uncovering a tangled web of collusion. The Lakeview Pines HOA board had quietly partnered with an out-of-state development firm. Their plan, to convert several homes near the lake into a luxury shopping center and parking complex. Margaret's property was the first domino in a grand scheme. More disturbing, some city officials might have been complicit, given how easily false documents have been notarized. Within days, the small town was in an uproar. Protests sprang up outside the HOA offices. Petitions calling for the immediate resignation of Cody Barnes garnered thousands of signatures. And yet, Barnes seemed unrepentant. He released a statement blaming poor communication and misinterpretation of the HOA's rights, as if that justified smashing an elderly widow's home to bits. Michael, determined to get swift justice, pressed charges for trespassing, property damage, and harassment. But large-scale legal cases can take time. While lawyers maneuvered through the courts, Margaret was left without a home. She stayed with Michael, but she grieved openly each day. "I know it's just walls and floors, but it's where your father and I shared our lives," she lamented. The heartbreak was palpable. For Michael, every piece of rubble in that house was a reminder of how quickly greed could trample over people's cherished histories. The community rallied around Margaret. Local restaurants offered free meals. Volunteers collected donations to help her rebuild. But the overshadowing question remained: would justice be done, or would the HOA skate by on technicalities? One evening, about a week after the demolition, Michael hosted a town hall meeting. Emotions ran high. Residents demanded answers. Some called for the complete dissolution of the HOA. Others insisted on new regulations to limit HOA's power. Cody Barnes and his cronies were nowhere to be seen. Midway through the meeting, an unexpected visitor arrived. An older man named Judge Allen Hightower, a long-retired circuit judge who had quietly attended Margaret's church for years. He stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "I'll keep this brief. I've reviewed the so-called documents used to demolish Mrs. Taylor's home. They are riddled with legal inaccuracies. This was an act of grand-scale vandalism, under the guise of authority. While I no longer preside on the bench, let me assure you, no legitimate court in this county would have upheld that order." A hush fell over the room as Judge Hightower continued. "I implore the district attorney to move swiftly in prosecuting all responsible parties. And if the city council has any respect for property rights, you'll enact measures to prevent such abuses." The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time in days, Michael felt hope flicker. A man with an impeccable reputation had spoken firmly. Justice might finally be within reach. Yet, behind the scenes, the tension hadn't abated. Rumors swirled that Barnes was planning to skip town or had powerful financiers covering his back. Michael realized they needed irrefutable evidence linking Barnes directly to the demolition orders. Otherwise, he could claim he was misled by underlings. Sylvia joined forces with the police to comb through email chains and phone records. They found partial evidence of a money trail leading from a corporation called Lakeside Horizons LLC to the HOA's treasury. But it wasn't enough to nail Barnes personally. Then, in a twist, Bill, Margaret's brave neighbor, came forward. He had overheard Barnes speaking with the demolition crew before the teardown, instructing them to move out the old lady's junk and level the place. Bill had captured part of that conversation on his smartphone, grainy but audible. It was a potential smoking gun. If authenticated, it could prove Barnes ordered the demolition himself, fully aware it was illegal. That night, Michael sat in his study, phone on speaker, listening to the audio. His heart pounded at Barnes' callous tone. "Crewman, you sure it's okay? Thought the homeowner's still there." "Barnes, we have the paperwork. She's not in compliance. If anyone complains, tell him the HOA authorized it. The old lady's got him moved." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. This was it, the solid evidence they needed. "We've got him," he whispered. He was about to share the recording with Sylvia when a frantic knock sounded at his front door. It was Bob Lansing, looking grave. "Mike, your mother just got another threat. They left a note on her car. It says, 'Drop the charges or else.' We need to move her to a safe place tonight." Michael felt his stomach clench. Even with the tide of public opinion turning against them, Barnes and his associates were still fighting back, stooping to scare tactics. This was a brand of ruthless that Lakeview Pines had never known. "We'll keep her safe," Michael promised, swallowing hard. "But now we have the evidence to put an end to this." The question looming large: would that evidence be enough before things took an even darker turn? The following morning, in a private meeting at the district attorney's office, Michael, Chief Lansing, and Sylvia presented the audio recording. The DA, a gray-haired man named Jerome Foster, listened with stony composure. When it ended, he rubbed his chin. "That's clearly Barnes' voice giving the go-ahead to demolish the property without legal grounds," Foster concluded. "We can proceed with charges of criminal mischief, conspiracy, and possibly intimidation." A sense of relief washed over Michael. "So we can finally make an arrest?" Foster nodded grimly. "I'll have a warrant issued by this afternoon. We'll also be looking into Lakeside Horizons LLC for their role in this." Sure enough, word spread within hours that Cody Barnes was a wanted man. But the HOA president was nowhere to be found. The police visited his home, only to find it emptied of personal belongings. Rumor had it he'd fled across state lines. "I'm not letting him get away," Michael vowed. He realized this was bigger than just a local matter now, possibly a multi-state manhunt if Barnes had truly gone on the run. The FBI might even get involved if interstate fraud was proven. Meanwhile, Margaret was relocated to a safe house in a nearby suburb, courtesy of the local police. She spent her days quietly, reading or knitting, trying to process the trauma of losing her home. Although she was grateful for the support, it wasn't easy living in an unfamiliar place. "I miss my neighbors," she would say in phone calls with Michael. "I miss the old oak trees out front." Despite her sorrow, she was heartened by the outpouring of kindness from the community. Neighbors organized fundraisers to help rebuild. The city council approved a provisional fund to compensate victims of illegal property damage. Slowly but surely, Lakeview Pines was rallying to heal the wound inflicted by Barnes' scheme. Days turned into a tense week. Then, at 5:30 a.m. on a Monday, Michael's phone rang. Chief Lansing's voice came through, charged with urgency. "We've got him, Mike." Barnes was picked up at a motel 2 counties over. He tried to pay cash and keep a low profile, but a clerk recognized him from the news. "He's in custody now." Relief coursed through Michael. He stood by as Lansing confirmed the details, and soon the entire town knew Cody Barnes was caught. The legal process wouldn't be swift, but at least the prime orchestrator would face the consequences. A few days later, prosecutors formally indicted Barnes. During the arraignment, he appeared tired, less confident than before. But he still pleaded not guilty, claiming, "I relied on advice from my legal team." No one bought it. The judge set bail high, and Barnes couldn't post it immediately. While he stewed in jail, Lakeside Horizons LLC severed ties with the Lakeview Pines HOA, condemning Barnes' actions to save face. The rest of the HOA board members resigned in disgrace, leaving the association leaderless and in legal limbo. Despite all this, the question of justice for Margaret remained. Yes, Barnes would likely do time, and large fines might be levied. But her home was gone. One afternoon, Michael took her to the site for a final look. The city had cleared away some of the debris for safety, leaving a flattened patch of earth and a haunting emptiness. Margaret stood there, tears brimming. "So much laughter, so many memories, all gone," she murmured. Michael put an arm around her shoulders. "I promise, Ma, we'll rebuild if that's what you want." She gave a brave nod. "Let's do it, son. I'm not letting him steal my legacy." The community pitched in with labor, materials, and volunteer architects who offered to replicate the original floor plan with modern safety standards. In a heartwarming gesture, local carpenters built new cabinetry identical to the ones Margaret used for decades. A few months later, the day finally came when Margaret cut the ribbon on her freshly rebuilt home. People from all over Lakeview Pines showed up to celebrate. Even the local news covered it as a story of triumph over adversity. She may have lost her original house, but Margaret gained something else, a profound reminder that kindness and unity can prevail over greed. Standing on the new front porch, she thanked everyone with teary eyes. "You've given me back a piece of my life," she said, voice trembling with emotion. The crowd broke into applause. For Michael, the entire ordeal had been both a personal and political trial. His approval rating soared, though he rarely thought about that. The bigger victory in his eyes was seeing people come together to protect one another. In his next term, he championed new legislation limiting the power of HOAs to invoke property condemnations without direct municipal oversight. The ordinance passed with overwhelming support. In the end, the Lakeview Pines HOA was forced to reconstitute under new leadership, with strict guidelines to prevent future abuses. The old board members faced civil lawsuits, and Barnes was eventually sentenced to several years in prison for his crimes. When asked by a reporter if he had any remorse, Barnes merely scowled. Meanwhile, Margaret settled into her rebuilt home, grateful to share new memories with her grandkids and great-grandkids. The once shattered windows were replaced by bright, welcoming panes. The living room, where so many family gatherings had taken place, stood once again ready to host holiday feasts and Sunday teas. Sometimes, Margaret would pause in that living room, gazing at a photograph of her old home in its original glory. A pang of loss would surface, followed by a wave of gratitude for the second chance. She never wanted this to happen to anyone else, especially the elderly. She told Michael, "We have to keep fighting for the ones who can't fight for themselves. Don't let them be bullied out of their lives." Michael took those words to heart. In every public speech he delivered afterward, he reminded the town, community means looking out for each other. When forces, big or small, threaten our neighbors, we stand up. That's what defines Lakeview Pines. The day Barnes' conviction was announced, Margaret was in her rebuilt kitchen, enjoying a cup of tea. Michael broke the news over the phone, and she quietly said, "Now maybe my memories can rest in peace." In the months and years that followed, the case became a cautionary tale for small towns everywhere. It wasn't just about an HOA gone rogue. It was about how quickly unchecked power can hurt the very people it's supposed to serve. But for Margaret, it had a simpler meaning. Even when her walls came down, the community built them up again, stronger than ever. If you found this story meaningful, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a reminder that unity, kindness, and persistence can overcome the worst injustices. And always remember, standing up for our elders protects the heart of every community.